Everything we do is dependent upon our partnership and relationship to a large extent with Southern civil society. The concept of freedom to operate, the legal framework within which we operate, and we've seen a ongoing crackdown, part of the systematic crackdown by different governments on what we, in our shorthand, called civil society space. And one of the key responses to this reality around the world has been an effort launched by President Obama called Stand with Civil Society in 2013, which is to provide basically a supportive environment to coordinate diplomatic pressure and to push back on these undue restrictions on this space. And they've gone further in terms of looking at stronger collaboration, consultation, closer partnership with civil society. There are a number of key InterAction members who have been at the heart of this partnership with the White House. But we thought it would be a useful way, since this topic of the challenge to the operational, legal, regulatory environment, or basically, if you get it down to it, is the challenge to the ability of civil society to have a voice. We thought it would be critical to close our forum with a discussion on this topic. And who best but to open this up, we thought, would be the Assistant to the President and Deputy National Security Advisor, Ben Rhodes, who has been a key leader in this. And Ben would just like to welcome you up onto the stage. Thanks.
I'm very happy to join you here today. And I want to thank Sam and InterAction for inviting me and for focusing on what is really a critical issue here this afternoon in terms of the closing space for civil society. I have to say I've long admired InterAction. One of my former bosses, Lee Hamilton, was a board member, and I remember I used to look at the preparations for meetings like this and just be overwhelmed by the breadth of organizations and the work that you do around the world. So you should be congratulated for that. I also know that the world can be a daunting place today. In my job, it often seems like we're dealing with crisis after crisis, and it's easy for your day to be dominated by whatever the worst situation is around the world. But one thing President Obama always reminds us is that we have to keep our eye on the longer game, on the difference that we can make in lives here in America and around the world. And that is why I think so much of our agenda overlaps with InterActions. Our efforts, like yours, to eliminate extreme poverty and vulnerability, to strengthen human rights and civil participation, to safeguard a sustainable planet, and, of course, overarching efforts on behalf of peace and dignity for all people. And I make these points because they lead to a very simple truth, which is that America's support for civil society is not something that we do as a side project. Our support for civil society is fundamental to all of the national interests that we work to advance around the world every single day. Our foreign policy cannot succeed unless civil society succeeds. That's not because you are in any way an extension of the U.S. government, but it's because we share a lot of the objectives that you are pursuing on the front lines around the world, whether it's pushing for more political rights, delivering humanitarian assistance, coming up with solutions that are frankly often more creative than anything that government could come up with on our own. Just because we agree on a lot of these big things doesn't mean we expect you to agree with everything that we do. Part of what is so important about civil society is that you push and prod governments, including our own, to be better. And I welcome that pressure. It keeps us honest and accountable, and you can help us fill gaps that frankly need to be filled either by the government of the United States or by other actors. So President Obama understands this uniquely. He began his public life as a civil society activist, working with churches and others in communities in Chicago to help people who were affected by layoffs and overlooked by their own government. And so that's why a number of years ago he pressed us to think hard about how we can better support civil society in the current environment, which led to the Stand with Civil Society initiative that we launched 2 years ago that I'll say a few words about today. So before I give an update on these efforts, let me talk a little bit about what set us down this road, and then I'll talk about what we've done, the lessons we've learned, and look forward to hearing from you as well. First, a few observations about how we see the current environment. The relevance of civil society, in our view, is only increasing. The major trends that are shaping life in this century are making civil society that much more relevant. And I say that because we define civil society broadly, too, as reflected in the audience here. Formal organizations, large and small, faith-based organizations, the media, citizen activists, folks who are focusing on political issues and closing space, but also, of course, people who are affected by closing space who are focused on development work and improving the lives of people around the globe. We know that power itself is becoming more diffuse around the world, among states, between governments and those they govern. And as technology empowers individuals, it also increases the capacity of individuals to organize. As problems become transnational, organizations have the opportunity to learn from one another. And this holds extraordinary promise for people around the world who are organizing to make their own lives and the lives of their fellow citizens better. But, of course, the observation that brings us here today is that there is a concerted effort in many parts of the world to limit the space in which civil society operates. And precisely because of this increased relevance and potential capacity of civil society, I believe we have seen a global crackdown on civil society and freedom of expression, association, and assembly. And according to the International Center for Not-for-Profit Law, since 2012, 50 countries, including some nominally democratic states, have adopted laws designed to restrict civil society organizations or curtail your funding. And if we include countries that have considered or enacted restrictive measures, the number goes up to over 90. You don't have to look far to find the anecdotal evidence for this. In Russia, a politics and propaganda rooted in fear cast every civil society effort as a Western-backed color revolution. And we see a very concerted effort by Russia, not just within their own borders, but within their neighborhood, to convey this message that a civil society organization is something to be feared. It is a tool of the West. I myself have made it onto sanctions lists for being a party to supporting civil society. But you see the effect that this is having, a chilling effect that, again, extends far beyond Russia's borders. In China, we see Western media facing restrictions, but also, of course, Chinese citizens facing a great firewall on the internet, even as we also see activists who are raising awareness on issues like air quality and corruption. In the aftermath of the Arab Spring, instead of finding new models for political participation, many activists have found themselves facing new obstacles. And from the Americas to Africa, there have been advances in democracy, but we see very strong pockets of resistance that have focused on civil society. And also, we must acknowledge that America's own efforts and legal frameworks to combat terrorism have been used by other countries, sometimes accidentally, sometimes intentionally, as a tool to make it harder for NGOs to operate. So we recognize our own responsibility to take on these issues. And so this led us to a final observation, which is that we need to rethink how we support civil society given these new realities. We'll continue the traditional forms of support that we provide, the funding, the partnership and advocacy with organizations like yours. But we have to adjust to this new reality as well. The President's guidance to us a couple of years ago was very clear. We can't just take for granted the steady advance of democracy and human rights and space for civil society. We have to be very mindful of efforts to stigmatize civil society as an extension of America or the West. We have to make sure that our support, frankly, does not put civil society at risk, but instead empowers civil society. We have to broaden the tools that we have to push back against closing space, learning from what works and what doesn't work. And we have to engage with more non-governmental actors around the globe, not less, and not be chilled by these efforts in different parts of the world. And we also need to connect organizations with one another so they can draw on the support of their colleagues, which is precisely what InterAction does. And the U.S. government can be a convening authority in that respect, in building new coalitions among governments, non-governmental organizations, and international institutions. So in September 2013, President Obama launched the Stand With Civil Society initiative, a global call to action to support, defend, and sustain civil society. And since then, we've been working in partnership with other governments, the philanthropic community, and multilateral initiatives, focusing really on three different lines of effort. Modeling positive engagement between governments and civil society to create a more supportive environment, in line with international norms. Second, developing new assistance tools and programs to support civil society, and coordinating multilateral and diplomatic pressure to push back against restrictions. Let me now share with you some updates on how we see this work going forward, how we're doing some things differently, what lessons we're learning, and then, again, I look forward to hearing from you about how we can further advance and institutionalize this work. First, precisely because civil society is so important to everything that the United States does around the world, we are making our support for civil society a part of everything that we do around the world. After we launched the initiative, we drew lessons from all of our diplomatic posts around the world. We asked them to tell us how they engaged civil society, how they saw the environment in their countries, what worked, what didn't work. And while we learned that many embassies and USAID missions are doing extraordinary work, there wasn't a clear prioritization or roadmap for how to combat closing space and support civil society. Posts were essentially having to deal with this in their own countries without being able to draw from lessons in other places, and frankly, without making use of all the different agencies that the United States government has operating in the international space. So in order to elevate and sustain our efforts across our government, the President issued the presidential memorandum on deepening U.S. government efforts to collaborate with and strengthen civil society. And when he signed it last year, he said very clearly that this memorandum meant that partnering and protecting civil society groups around the world is now a mission across the U.S. government. It's a part of American leadership. And so since then, what we've been able to do is expand our efforts in different agencies of the U.S. government, where engagement with civil society has not been as prominent, especially in restrictive environments. So we're dealing with, obviously, the State Department and USAID, but we have many other agencies and departments who work around the world, whether it's the economic agencies like Treasury and Commerce, whether it's investment agencies. There are many tools that the United States has to bring to bear. And we wanted to make sure that whether it's how senior officials engage around the world, what the agenda is, that civil society and closing space is higher up on the priority list. So we looked at a range of ways to strengthen engagement with civil society, to oppose efforts to restrict freedoms, and to provide additional technical assistance and support to governments who want to strengthen collaboration with civil society. In places wherever it is possible, the memorandum called for facilitating dialogue between governments and civil society so that the U.S., again, is engaged in trying to bring together governments and the non-governmental sector where we can make progress, and I'll come to some of those examples. What this also did is it lifted up the prioritization of civil society alongside other foreign policy priorities like counterterrorism. And one way in which we're navigating these priorities, for instance, is to deepen the engagement between our Treasury Department and the nonprofit sector as part of the Financial Action Task Force process. So that, again, even as we have laws and authorities that allow us to crack down on terrorist financing, we want to make sure that Treasury is engaged with the nonprofit sector so that we don't have governments taking advantage of those laws, frankly, to cut back on the ability of civil society to be funded. And we've held a formal consultation with the nonprofit sector on this. We've incorporated their feedback into best practices, and we are going to continue to work to prevent any abuse in this particular sector. We're also working to increase our efforts across the U.S. government to engage with countries where issues and tensions arise as they are drafting NGO laws and regulations. And I'm sure this has been a subject here today. But we want to get in the room with governments when they are drafting these laws so that they are not casting an overly broad brush. There are important policy intersections between, again, our support for civil society and national security, but plainly, in each country, we need to make clear and be nimble so that we're striking the right approach. And that's an approach in which we don't want to see these tools used in a way that goes beyond basic security requirements and getting into space where civil society needs to operate. We're also finding new ways to support civil society. And a key focus of our work is to expand, in partnership with others, how we can reach civil society in different regions. So as part of this initiative, we established a donor coordination group that currently includes the United States, Sweden, and a number of private philanthropic partners to build and promote and connect civil society in both open and closed spaces around the world through the establishment of new civil society innovation hubs. So the model here, as the President announced last year, is to create different hubs in different regions that will encourage cooperation, innovation, research, learning, and peer-to-peer exchanges between the United States, between civil society partners, and other supporters around the world. And rather than simply telling civil society what we think they need to do, the purpose of this donor coordination group that will establish these hubs is to work with civil society to define what each regional hub is so that it meets the needs of, for instance, the Americas. And we're focused right now, coming out of the Summit of the Americas, on establishing a regional hub in Latin America. These hubs we see as being both virtual and having physical spaces that will allow us to bring together the different tools and resources that we have to support civil society, including on mobilizing resources within regions, not just from the U.S. government, but from other supporters of civil society. And this can also be a platform for civil activists to seek and receive on-demand legal assistance as they're dealing with restrictive laws in different parts of the world. So these hubs, again, what we want to do with them is allow the U.S. government to be in more places, to not just focus on one country, but to focus on regions, to mobilize resources for civil society in those regions, but also, as we see specific problems that are unique to one part of the world, we can tailor approaches based on consultation with civil society in that part of the world. Beyond these hubs, we're broadening our engagement with new and emerging voices around the world. We've launched a number of programs that seek to get the United States further out in terms of our engagement. We've launched young leaders initiatives in Africa, Southeast Asia, and the Americas now that have reached nearly 200,000 young people. This allows young people to network with one another, can bring them into our diplomatic posts for contacts, bring fellows to the United States for education and internships, connect young people with other programming of the United States government and our partners overseas. And why this is so important is, frankly, a lot of these young people are starting up their own NGOs, or maybe they're connecting with NGOs like those in this room. And again, we want to provide the leadership training and development, but we also want to hear from them. We've met with young people recently from all 10 ASEAN countries. And when you hear from a young person in Cambodia or Myanmar or Vietnam or Thailand, you get a texture for what the environment is in those countries that will allow the U.S. government, when we make not just our civil society policies, but our foreign policies, to have a sense and an antenna for what civil society is facing. We've initiated a new strategy to engage religious leaders and faith communities around the world with a focus on interfaith dialogue, conflict resolution, development, and disaster response. Again, what this allows us to do is to go out and build relationships with leaders who have enormous credibility in their communities and work together on shared solutions. And we're ramping up our support for entrepreneurship, in part because we know that that creates economic growth. But the reason this is relevant, I think, to the conversation we're having here today is that what we see in our own analysis is that societies that foster entrepreneurship end up, again, creating space for people who are change agents and create opportunities for women and potentially marginalized communities. So, again, we're trying to cast a broader net in who we're engaging around the world so that we're able to push back against closing space, but also to add momentum to efforts of people who are trying to make change. And all of these efforts recognize the fundamental truth that the interests and values that America cares about are advanced when more people are reaching their potential. And then, of course, we're working to coordinate multilateral and diplomatic pressure to push back against the restrictions on civil society. We're obviously working within the United Nations system, but we've increased the time and the resources and energy we're investing in other multilateral bodies whose missions include support for open and vibrant public space. One is the Open Government Partnership, another is the Community of Democracies. And we've committed to providing funding for the Community of Democracies over the next 3 years to increase its capacity to protect and promote civic space, both so that, again, they can create additional opportunities for dialogue between the Community of Democracies member governments and civil society, including those from non-democratic states, and also to facilitate meetings such as the upcoming July ministerial in El Salvador that will bring together nearly 100 representatives of civil society from around the world. But central to our success in protecting the space for civil society is our ability to, again, learn from best practices in the field and from what we hear from you. And to highlight a few key areas and lessons learned of the last 2 years, I think that draws on your experience. We've learned that safeguarding space and building capacity for civil society must be a long-term effort. These issues don't often have quick fixes, and we're going to have to get better than the people who are trying to close space for civil society. We're going to have to anticipate the laws and regulations that people are imposing and get ahead of that and find approaches around that. Again, so civil society can continue to thrive even when it's under threat. There needs to be very early action during democratic transitions with local civil society in the lead. And what we've done in places like Myanmar, in places like Ukraine, is to try to immediately engage civil society and ensure that they're at the table as these transitions are being shaped. We're working to identify civil society champions in government and in legislatures. And again, this is a matter of us going to presidents and prime ministers, but it's also a matter of getting to know people in parliament where these laws are being drafted so that we can identify in different countries and work with, through our embassies, those who could be advocates and supporters of civil society and pushing back. We want, of course, to expand the consultations that include civil society and government, and the United States can convene those types of sessions in many countries with a focus on developing the legal frameworks that allow you to operate. And of course, we do want to support civil society efforts at self-regulation, transparency, and accountability because it makes it that much more challenging for those who want to discredit and delegitimize this sector. Now, we're disseminating these practices in a number of ways. Just to give you a few examples, at USAID, we have a legal enabling environment program that focuses on improving the environment for civil society by opposing efforts to restrict freedoms of expression, assembly, and association. And that's helped improve laws in El Salvador, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Macedonia, and Nicaragua over the last year. And we're working in Morocco and Tunisia to support more progressive laws going forward. We're also looking at potentially restrictive laws in Cambodia, Vietnam, and Kyrgyzstan that, again, we've been able to engage those governments in making very clear our objections. In Burma, we were able to work with a civil society working group that we provided technical assistance for during consultations with the parliament on a draft association law that had many, many flaws. Through the assistance, we were able to make improvements to the law that was ultimately enacted. It wasn't perfect, but it was much better from where it began. And if we didn't have the ability to engage early with civil society and connect them with parliament, that would not have happened. In Nigeria, we supported efforts from civil society organizations to develop a position paper against legislation that would restrict donor funding for civil society operations. In Kazakhstan, we're working with a number of organizations that are now consulted on a regular basis on legislative initiatives, including a criminal code, new NGO legislation, and a proposed policy to raise retirement age for women. And in Rwanda, USAID has developed alternative funding mechanisms and independent programs to counter attempts by the government to channel donor funding for civil society through government systems. And this is something that I think we're going to have to do in more countries around the world so that U.S. support and multilateral support reaches the people who need it, and it's not necessarily just channeled through the government to favored actors. And as I mentioned, in Ukraine, we worked very hard to ensure that civil society is at the table in developing the reforms that are passing through the Ukrainian parliament and seeking to establish a more stable and democratic country. So these are just a few examples of what we're doing. But again, this is the beginning of a long-term effort. We know it needs more resources. We know we need to draw from your lessons. And we know that, frankly, the work is going to continue to be hard. So let me close with just a note of optimism, though. President Obama makes it a priority to meet with young people in civil society. He's met with activists who are working against great odds to make change. He's met recently with a woman who catalogs abuses by the Venezuelan military, an activist in Thailand promoting awareness of human trafficking, a nurse from Liberia who led an effort to get medical supplies to fight Ebola, LGBT activists fighting a very difficult tide in Russia, a woman in Saudi Arabia who helped pass the first law there dedicated to fighting domestic violence, and again, most recently, a young woman from Myanmar advocating for the rights of the Rohingya through her organization. You know all these types of people. They work almost every day to make life a little bit better, to right wrongs, combat injustice, to solve problems. They answer not to their own government or the U.S. government. They answer to their own communities. And there's not any more powerful form of legitimacy than that. And that's why, frankly, I believe efforts to silence them will ultimately fail. That's not to say there won't be setbacks. In some countries, things will get worse before they get better. The United States, in our own foreign policy, will have to manage very difficult trade-offs. But what we can and must do is use our engagement to press for the rights of civil society, while engaging not just governments, but their people as well. And ultimately, though, I think we all must keep in mind that the future cannot belong to governments who are afraid of their own people. You can only keep a lid on for so long. And frankly, while we see increased efforts to close space, we do see a rising tide of activism, of technology, of interconnection that cannot be reversed. So if we are smart and nimble in our approaches, clearly, I believe that we can make sure that the closing space cannot hold down, frankly, what is, I think, a tide of civic activism that we see in all different parts of the world, and that it's going to do a lot more to shape this century than the people who are, frankly, trying to turn back the clock.